Hey everybody, it's Jenna. Today I want to talk about one of my most anticipated movies of the year, Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein. I saw it a few weeks ago in theaters, and although I do wish it had gotten a massive theatrical run because it definitely deserves it, I am so glad that it's now on Netflix and everyone seems to be talking about it. There is so much to it that I could just start rambling about. The details to the costume design, the nuance with which del Toro approaches the cycle of abuse, and Oscar Isaac and Jacob Elordi's performances. But there's also a connection that the movie has to comics that I just have to scream from the rooftops about. As I explained a bit in my Creature Commandos videos from last year, Frankenstein's comic history is unique. DC and Marvel have both, almost by accident, turned random one-off cameos into their own superheroic takes on the character, who can now bump elbows with the Justice League and the Avengers. They've also mashed up the origin story of Frankenstein with some of their most popular superheroes, including Batman, Superman, and one of my favorite stupid puns in all of comics, Frankencastle. And countless other publishers have taken their own cracks at Frankenstein, ranging from deathly serious attempts at adapting Mary Shelley's novel, to horror that somehow morphed into humor. In the mid-60s, a young comic artist named Bernie Wrightson began to experiment with the idea of a new comic adaptation of Frankenstein, only for it to fizzle out after a few pages. Pretty soon after, Wrightson's work began to be professionally published, in newspapers and in DC and Marvel's horror anthology titles, like House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Tower of Shadows, and Chamber of Darkness. In 1971, he and writer Len Wein unintentionally changed the course of comic history, after a conversation about Wrightson breaking up with his girlfriend led to them collaborating on their own tortured monster, DC's Swamp Thing, who they introduced in House of Secrets number 92. After years of working at DC and establishing a lot of Swamp Thing's early supporting cast and status quo, Wrightson then left to work on black and white horror comics for Warren Publishing. All the while, the idea of adapting Frankenstein never seemed to leave his head. In the early to mid-70s, he partnered with a French publisher on another graphic novel, only for that to fall through due to, in his words, quote, financial or corporate crap. Around 1975 or 1976, Wrightson realized that, quote, I still felt the urge to tell the story visually, and like I said, I just couldn't find a way into it as a comic book adaptation. So much would be lost, I thought, in the transition that a graphic novel version would ultimately diminish the novel itself. And by this time, I'd reread the novel so many times and fallen so in love with it, I finally decided to simply illustrate the novel itself. And so, he did. In total, Wrightson drew more than 50 black and white illustrations, leaning into an aesthetic and techniques that he thought would look like an antique from the 1800s. He also leaned very heavily into Shelley's original descriptions for the character designs, instead of any of the cultural iconography that had already existed at the time. As a result, the creature doesn't look like the square-headed, bolts-and-neck silhouette that everyone recognizes to this day. He is still a gigantic presence, but in a form that is almost skeletal, which adds a new kind of vulnerability to him. In a way, it is so easy to see the connection between Shelley's text, Wrightson's early drawings for Swamp Thing, and eventually his drawings for Frankenstein. And those drawings are something to behold. They are intricate and sweeping and composed in such a visually interesting way that still feels ahead of its time. And they are even more of a miracle once you learn two things. One, they took a total of 6 to 7 years to complete. And two, they were all unpaid work at first. In Wrightson's own words, quote, it was not an assignment, it was not a job. I would do the drawings in between paying gigs when I had enough to be caught up with bills and groceries and whatnot. I would take 3 days here, a week there to work on the Frankenstein volume. He wasn't a stranger to making art purely for the love of the game. His first published work in 1966's Creepy Number 9 was literally a piece of fan art, but it still sounds unheard of once you actually see the pieces. Even Wrightson himself was kind of amazed by how they turned out, saying after the fact that, quote, when it was all done, I felt that I had made a passage or completed a journey, like I had completed something important, you know, personally. I had spent a long time pushing the boulder up the hill and I had finally gotten there, like I had passed a milestone or something, and now I could get on with the rest of my life. I can look at those drawings now with a sense of pride and satisfaction and appreciate how good they are. Sometimes I marvel a bit, almost as though they were done by someone else. And in a way, they were done by someone else. A young artist, unafraid of hard work, obsessed really. The first printing of Wrightson's illustrated Frankenstein was released in 1983, with Marvel handling the softcover copies. And the legend around it has only grown in the decades since, between fans hunting down the reprints put out by various publishers, and Wrightson's original art selling for massive amounts of money at auction. Wrightson and writer Steve Niles also started work on a sequel titled Frankenstein Alive Alive, which began to be published in 2012. That brings me to Guillermo del Toro and the decades-long journey of his Frankenstein. Back in 2008, when he signed a first-look deal with Universal, he almost immediately expressed a desire to make a Frankenstein movie inspired by Wrightson's aesthetic. Del Toro even hoped to have Wrightson design the monster, and it seems like he got to, in some capacity. According to frequent Del Toro collaborator Doug Jones, pre-production initially began around 2009 or 2010, with Spectral Motion working on translating the creature from Wrightson's designs. Quote, "My first thought is that I'm not the big, broad, big-boned, lumbering Frankenstein that you have in mind. But it was told to me Guillermo is a big fan of Bernie Wrightson and a friend of Bernie Wrightson, and Bernie had illustrated a version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and all of the images of Frankenstein's monster in that's what he was going to pattern my look after, which was more emaciated, little skinnier, little more pathetic looking, and yet had an unnatural physical prowess, an unnatural athleticness to him. He was sewn together with spare parts from a couple different bodies. Very bony face, long, stringy, drawn hair. Although Jones didn't even get to try on the prosthetic makeup for the creature, he did get to see a bust of it, and he had a very visceral reaction. Quote, "It was like, honestly, my eyes welled. It was so hauntingly beautiful, and it did pay reverence to Bernie Wrightson's artwork and gave you a different looking Frankenstein's monster than what you're used to." The movie didn't come to fruition at Universal, but the love between Del Toro and Wrightson remained. In 2016, Del Toro regarded the 9 original Wrightson Frankenstein illustrations that he owned to be among his prized possessions, ultimately putting one up for auction earlier this year after the LA fires. And when Wrightson passed away in 2017, Del Toro called him, quote, "the greatest that ever lived, my North Dark Star of youth, a master," and took a 24-hour vow of silence in his honor. In the lead up to Frankenstein's release, Del Toro did confirm Wrightson's involvement, but did say it wouldn't be a direct adaptation of what he did in his illustrations. Quote, "We're quoting it very little. There are 3 specific poses that remind you of him, but it has the spirit he created," adding that, quote, "Karloff looms eternal, Bernie looms eternal, but we are not doing Karloff, and we are not doing Bernie, and we're not doing Mary. But I'll say this. Mary Shelley, Bernie Wrightson, and Karloff are as important to me as my father and mother. They gave birth to who I am. Period." Isaac and Elordi both basically wallpapered their spaces with Wrightson's pieces, with Elordi saying, quote, "I turned it into this shrine to all things that I felt pertain to the creature." Bernie's pictures were all over the walls. Maybe when you're asleep or just walking around it all, you end up soaking it in. Honestly, you could probably tell that just from seeing Elordi in the movie, but it is still so lovely to have it confirmed. And if you watch through the movie's end credits, which I know is a tall order for Netflix given how quickly it usually starts giving you pop-ups autoplaying other things, you'll see that he's credited twice. First in Del Toro's dedication, alongside Shelley, Boris Karloff, and James Whale, and later in the following credit, quote, "Frankenstein character design inspired in part by Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein monster. Early concept development and early concept sculptures by Spectral Motion and Bernie Wrightson." I know a lot of you watching this might not have even seen those credits, and if you did, you might not have recognized Wrightson's name to begin with, but it just makes me so happy to see him get his flowers, both in the context of this movie and just in general. Without getting too far into spoilers, Del Toro approaches the story of Frankenstein from such a unique angle. He is reverential to Shelley's text, but he isn't beholden to it. And the changes he does make provide an opportunity to tackle some of the story's universal themes, otherness, self-actualization, and cycles of abuse, without it ever feeling exploitive or triggering. Instead, it feels so cathartic and beautiful and rooted in something uniquely human, especially where Elordi's creature is concerned. And that feeling of raw, earnest humanity has felt so prominent in so much of Wrightson's work. Remember, we wouldn't have Swamp Thing if he hadn't broken up with his girlfriend. So it feels so right for his creature design to be used to tell this kind of story. The way Frankenstein honors Wrightson also just makes me happy given where we're at with comic book adaptations. Some projects have definitely gotten better at crediting and compensating the creators whose work inspired what's on screen, but there are still some ways that it could be so much better. I feel like a good chunk of fans just take that paragraph of credited names for granted, both because they are just blissfully ignorant as to who those people are, and because they are just apathetically waiting for some sort of post-credit scene. Sure, Frankenstein isn't a comic book movie in a traditional sense, but I still love the fact that Del Toro is giving Wrightson very specific credit for his comic-based work. Once you've been in the comic book fandom long enough, Del Toro's love for the medium becomes overwhelmingly apparent, not just in the projects that he has made, but in the laundry list of superhero movies that he's wanted to make that have never come to fruition. So it shouldn't be a surprise, but it is still such a joy to see. And I love that it's given the world an excuse to talk about someone whose talents were so singular. Have you seen Frankenstein? What did you think of it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends if you haven't already done so. As always, you can find me on social media, especially on Threads at Hey It's Jenna Lynn. Merch is available at the link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, go read some comics.